Okay, so good morning. So we have for this presentation Joanne Harding, who's a part of the Suicide Prevention Board, and she's just going to speak to us about all the amazing work that she does. So here she is.
Thank you, Kelly. One thing I would say, it's not just I don't do amazing work. It's a team. It's an absolute team, and honestly, the people who sit around the Suicide Prevention Partnership Board are incredible. All really motivated and leaders across Trafford, really wanting to make sure that we reduce deaths by suicide across Trafford. So I guess just before I start, I'll introduce myself. And as there's only a small number of us, I haven't got a PowerPoint. I did have one, but I'll send it on after. Technology wasn't my friend this morning, but I thought as there's only a few of us, it could probably be a good idea to make it more conversational, because I tend to prefer, now we're all working remotely like this, it can feel really sterile and not a great way to work. So it might be quite nice to try and make it interactive and me to share some of your thoughts and concerns about how we progress this agenda across Trafford. So my name is Joanne Harding, and I'm one of the councillors in Trafford. I represent the ward of Urmston and have done since 2011. And some of the roles that I have in the council, I'm the executive member for adult social care, which covers a wide-ranging portfolio such as domiciliary home care, care homes, substance misuse and learning disability and autism and mental health. And some of the other roles that I have as a part of that portfolio is I chair the Age Well Board and I chair the Prevention Partnership Board, which is what I'm going to speak to you about today. So the board really is a collection of individuals across Trafford, and they may well be professionals that are working in the field of mental health, but not always. For example, we have Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue are a member of the board. We have the Department of Work and Pensions. We have representatives from the voluntary sector. So it's a real collective, and importantly, most importantly, we have people with lived experience on the board, and we have parents who have been bereaved by suicide on the board. And I think that's an absolutely critical part of the work that we do, because it's not about being a group of professionals speaking jargon around the table and saying what we think needs to happen. What's important is that we really understand some of the failings, and watching the video that we've all just watched, it's fairly evident that there are significant failings across children and young people's mental health services. I think one of the hardest things to hear is when you know that a young person wants help and needs help, and then they face a significant wait time to be able to access the help that they need. When you need help at that moment, you need help at that moment. What you don't need is somebody to tell you that you have a 12-week wait before you can see a professional. I think that's absolutely heartbreaking. And I say that as a mum of a 16-year-old who, as a result of lockdown, I've seen my child go from a very vibrant and outgoing young woman to somebody who's experienced anxiety and fear about the future, because we all know we're living in uncertain times. So I think one of the key things to say is that we can all be plodding along that nicely in a life where we think our child is absolutely fine, and then actually something happens that triggers a response that your child isn't fine. And sometimes as a parent, you don't know what to say or do to make it better. Also my background is in substance misuse and mental health. I've been a drug and alcohol worker for over 20 years and managed a mental health crisis service. But when my child was saying to me that she was struggling, it was a bit like I wasn't in professional mode. It was like, what can I do to make this better? So I guess what I'm saying is, from an authentic point of view, I can see it from all sides. And that video, I think, was incredibly telling. And we have a way to go in getting young people's services right. So if I talk about the reason the board exists, really, we use expressions such as terms of reference, and I think jargon sometimes is just one of those things that we expect members of the public to join our boards and be involved, and then we speak a language that nobody understands. So what I always try to do is make sure that we break down those barriers and say, you know, a plan on a page, and this is exactly what we're trying to achieve this board. So we are guided by national policy, really. So the government will set national policies. So we've had suicide prevention strategy, we've had 5-year forward, we've had healthy young minds, and now we have the long-term plan. So those will be national policy, which will set out a direction of travel of what we want to achieve, really. And then from a local point of view, what we then do is think about what information do we have about Trafford residents? What does our data tell us? What do we need to do to reduce suicide across Trafford, really? And I would say that Trafford, as part of Greater Manchester, has one of the lowest rates of suicide. So on average, there's about 15 people per year, and that's 15 people too many, frankly. It's 15 people too many. So we have a way to go. What's come out of COVID is lots of media interest in saying that there's been an increase in deaths around suicide as a result of COVID. I would urge caution about how we report that and how we talk about that, because actually, and the Samaritans have done some fantastic media reporting on this. There is often a lag of when a death is recorded, because the death is recorded after an inquest, when an inquest has ruled that the death is by suicide. So we don't yet have a clear picture about how COVID has impacted upon suicide rates. What we do know is that COVID has impacted significantly upon our mental health and well-being. And as I'm here to talk about children and young people, I think we all know that COVID has impacted significantly upon the mental health and well-being of young people. So to revisit my the terms of reference, so it's to oversee that strategy. We've got national policy, then we have to translate that to local level. It's an all-age board. So what we focus on is, as part of the way things work in Trafford, you have what's called the Health and Wellbeing Board. And the Health and Wellbeing Board is the umbrella board that sets all the health commissioning policies and what we need to think about for all of Trafford. Underneath the Health and Wellbeing Board are the 3 subgroups. So we have the Start Well, which focuses very much on young people, and so from preconception to pregnancy and young people. Then we have the Live Well Board, which focuses on the adult age range up to 55. Then the Age Well Board is 55 plus. So all of those subgroups will focus on health priorities that we need to work on in Trafford for those age groups. And the Suicide Prevention Partnership is all age. So what do we need to do to reduce death by suicide across all ages? The board will also focus on what's termed as the wider determinants of health. I don't know whether that's an expression that you're familiar with. You may have heard the expression health inequalities. And what that tends to mean is that if somebody's experiencing a mental health crisis, there are a variety of factors which will trigger that mental health crisis. So if you have somebody who, for example, is experiencing financial hardship, they have debt issues, they're really worried about debt and they can't see a way out of it, that could potentially be a trigger. If you have somebody who's had a relationship breakdown and again hasn't got strong support networks and doesn't know how to that could be a trigger. People who are living in poor housing, who have unemployment issues, who have long-term health conditions. So the wider determinants of health help us look at the whole person, if you like. That's basically what we're talking about, the whole person. So the board aims to reduce health inequalities and improve a whole person's life. And one of the main aims of the board is to think about prevention. If we get in early enough, the aim is to prevent any deaths by suicide. And sadly, evidence suggests that people who take their own lives by suicide, many of those individuals won't have been known to services before. Many people won't have been known to their GP. and it's about how we raise the awareness of suicide and reduce the stigma around speaking about mental health and well-being. So those are our priorities. So we'll look at prevention, what the intervention needs to be, and then something called postvention. And that means how we support people who may have been bereaved by suicide. So that's one of the priorities of the board too. So has anybody got any questions at this point? Because rather than me just talk at you, I'd rather you ask me something or drop something into the conversation, and then we can just speak about things. No? Do you want me to carry on? Okay. So I spoke about deprivation and other priorities. So if we look at some of the statistics, what we tend to find in Trafford is that we have a higher number of people experiencing suicidal thoughts and feelings in those areas where there's more deprivation, and that's the same to be said across the whole of the country. That's not just Trafford specific. So that's why it's really important that we focus on those health issues and we make life better for people who are experiencing things like poverty and feel that they have no way of getting out of those situations. So it's so important that we focus on the whole person. Another aim that we have is to reduce social isolation and loneliness. And I'm sure we'll know, certainly throughout COVID, where people have not been able to see their loved ones throughout this time. People have been shielding because they may have long-term conditions, and lots of people are digitally excluded. I mean, this is fantastic that we're able to host a conference today online and we can still connect with each other. There are thousands of people across Trafford that simply don't have that luxury, that not only are they not going out and seeing people and seeing families, they have no other way of connecting with the world sometimes. So that's a priority across Trafford, how we make sure people are included on a digital platform too. As we're talking about children and young people, one of the projects on board is to make sure that we improve the health and well-being of children and young people and pregnant women. So we need to make sure that the services that we commission in Trafford are right for pregnant women and for postnatal support. So we'll work very closely with midwives and health visitors. And what we very often do as part of the suicide board, there's another body in Trafford called the Health Scrutiny Committee. I don't know whether any of you've heard of Health Scrutiny Committee. And scrutiny is a cross-party. So whilst I might be a Labour Party politician, the Health Scrutiny Committee is made up of Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats and Greens, because health is above politics. And what we do is they can hold me to account as the chair of the board and ask me to come to Health Scrutiny and say, what are you doing to make sure that we are providing adequate services for children and young people? And in fact, when I was chair of Health Scrutiny, we did a report on CAMS and young people. And there are 10 recommendations that come out of that report. And that will be things like, how do we engage better with schools? How do we engage better with the youth cabinet to make sure that they tell us as young people what they need, not us saying what we think they need. They work very closely with us. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the board is only one element of the work we do around mental health with young people. There are different structures that hold that board to account, and we all have to try and work together to make sure that we meet the aims of the board. So as I mentioned, it's multi-agency, and we have the probation service attend, because Trafford, we have Trafford residents that are in prisons. So we have a duty of care to look after people that are on probation, that are in prisons, and that will also include young people. There are young people that may be in young offender institutes. We have a duty of care to make sure that they are well looked after. The Department of Work and Pensions, and one of the things I'm going to talk about is some training, which I think will do. Whether any, I'll send the link. Shining a Light on Suicide is a Greater Manchester resource, and they have some fantastic training. It's only half an hour, and they use a case study of an older man who's become unemployed, and he attends the job centre, and at first he's all very, yes, I'm going to find another job, I'm positive, I'm motivated. and his caseworker over the coming weeks starts to notice that he is deteriorating. I'm just going to put my headphones in because there's a van pulling up and I've got a dog and I've just got a feeling that he's going to hurl himself at the window. So
honestly, I'm on calls and all of a sudden people can see this dog throwing himself. So we have departments of work and pensions. So for example, that would mean, again, you know, if somebody is turning up, and the jobs market at the minute is really fragile. You know, people's self-esteem, thinking, particularly when they get to a certain age, that they're not going to be able to find work. So the Department of Work and Pension tell us, as the Suicide Board, what steps they have in place to support people. We have Blue Sky, which are a charity which do mental health work in Trafford. And then we have Greater Manchester Mental Health and Social Care, which is the acute trust, which provide interventions. The ambulance service and lots of other individuals attend the board, really. And what we do is we look at the data on a regular basis. We look at some of the figures around suicide, and we try to do some work around what we call hotspots, which isn't a great expression. But for example, if we knew in Trafford that there was a particular railway bridge or a motorway bridge, or we knew that there was an area that young people or anybody was accessing, really, then we would want to do some work with Highways England or British Transport Police to think about. When I managed a mental health service, what we did is we worked very closely with those organisations to put signage up at some of those hotspots where, for example, the Samaritan's number was there. And if that was, and a lot of train stations will have the same, really. They have signage and messaging. So again, in Trafford, that's something that we're keen to support. So those are just some of the steps. And the ambulance service will work with us about some of the key areas in Trafford. With them, there was a key area in Trafford that they were getting more 999 calls. What do we need to do in that area to put some support individuals? So, you know, the ward Urmston, where I represent, if we suddenly noticed that there was more 999 calls coming from Urmston, what targeted interventions could we do there? So it's all very much led by data, and it's all very much led by then targeting to make sure that we get the work right. So in 2019, there were 5,691 deaths by suicide across the UK. That's 321 more than the year before. And as I said, every one of those deaths, one too many. But that's why I wanted to set the scene, really, when people say that COVID is creating an increase. We need to make sure that we understand why. And just some tips from the Suicide Board, really. Men is still the highest rate. But what we are noticing is that young women under the age of 25 are starting to talk to us more about suicidal thoughts and feelings. So we hosted a conference. We've had some feedback from young people. What they're telling us is that stigma is a big issue. They're telling us that they want some specific interventions for them. So we've taken those actions, and that's the work that we are going to do as part of the Suicide Prevention Board. I'm aware that I've spoken a lot and there's lots of information here. So I'm looking at the time, and I just didn't know whether there was any questions that anybody wanted to ask me.
Yeah.
Yep, sorry.
Is that me?
Yeah.
So nowadays, if someone went to their doctors in Trafford, in the Trafford area, could the doctor then would all the doctors know that they could refer them to you, or would they have a list of numbers other than referring them to what the NHS had to offer? Would they also have another list of numbers that they could refer people to?
Yeah, so they wouldn't refer to me and the board, because the board has strategic oversight about what we're trying to deliver in Trafford. But every GP should have training in suicide. Well, I say that doesn't necessarily mean they've had it, and training is one of our priorities. But what we do have is what's called the Trafford Service Directory. And in that service directory, there's a whole range. What we try to do, the earlier you can get in, so example, I know Cooth are here today, 42nd Street. There's lots of other services that are at the early end of intervention. But then as people hit crisis, there are other interventions. So every GP has access to the Trafford service directory. Yes.
Yeah, that's going to be really helpful, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think we have a way to go in relation.
For GPs more than, because it would seem that, it's not necessarily the National Health Service's fault that there aren't enough people, enough counsellors or enough, people to refer them to. So you have a 3-month waiting list. So yeah, it would help the GPs if they had somewhere else that they could go to,
Absolutely. And literally, as I said, the sooner we can start. So if, for example, prevention is always better than cure, isn't it? Of course it is. And now one of the aims of public health is to make sure that we get things done earlier. And it's about knowing what to do and what to say. A lot of people feel very fearful that if somebody says to them they're feeling suicidal, they think if they talk about it, it's going to make that person act on that. That is false. It's a myth. One of the best things to do is actually speak openly with somebody. And I know that's really difficult for an individual to do, because you might think, what do I do? What do I do if they tell me that I'm going to do that? And what I'm going to do is send a list of training that's available to everybody who's on this course, because that is about building confidence so that you can have those conversations and know where to refer people. But the best thing you can do is say to somebody, how are you? What do you need? How's your head is actually the way that the lead comms that we're using in Trafford, because it's just speaking in a very normal way to somebody and looking to support them. The sooner the better.